How you doing? My name is Jojo Mayer. Yeah, I spent my early childhood in the Far East in Hong Kong. My dad was the musical director of the Hilton Hotel back at that time, and then I came back to Switzerland, where I was born originally, and went to school in Switzerland. And after I finished school, I started touring around Europe, and I sort of leave Switzerland. Like my first professional gig was when I was going on the road with Monty Alexander, and that gave me kind of like a hub to play with some, the legendary jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie or Nina Simone, and kind of acquainted me with like a international audience. And but I started to build my career inside of Switzerland and the adjoining countries like Germany and Austria, and started getting into session work. And when I was in my early mid 20s, I decided to take the plunge and move out to New York, as I was always kind of like drawn to the music that came from that place. So I took the ditch and I went to New York, and I got in line with everybody else, and held my ears and grinded my teeth and started to look out for a place to play. When I first came to New York, I kind of, in certain respect, I felt home for the first time in my life. I felt like I grew up on like the wrong planet, and it was like, oh, this is where I belong. That's what home is. And I felt like I returned to the alien planet that it was taken from as a kid. It's like Jor-El going back to Krypton, somehow like that. And I could always relate to like New York. I mean, I don't know if I could live in any other place in America, because I don't consider New York to be America. It's this island floating in the Atlantic between Europe and America. So it kind of gives me the best of both worlds, it gives me the European old world culture that I love, but it also gives me some of the typically American traits, evidently like the music, and jazz and blues and R&B and rock and roll, and all the music that came out of it, electronic music, but always had the opportunity to culturally balance it out with some of the ways we do things in Europe, which is maybe Europe might be a little bit more, I don't know. It's hard to tell, but, I could find the eclecticism of America. I could relate to that from a European standpoint, because Europe is so fragmented, so it is eclectic. You have all these borders and different languages and cultures and cuisines, and New York kind of consolidates that into one city. So that's why I felt home being in New York and could relate to it culturally. When I first got to New York, I wanted to play jazz, and I wanted to play rock, and I wanted to play R&B and funk and hip hop, and all this. I was brought up basically just liking music and recognizing different qualities in different styles. I was never really like, okay, this is the style that I want to play. I was never that type of, I never wanted to confine myself into just one style of doing something. So that led me to choose a particular battle, which is like basically coming from the outside as being like a Swiss dude, entering, let's say, like, certain environments that were dominated by, more black community, like getting into to play with Michel Ndegeocello or James Paul Dolmer and Vernon Reid. As an outsider, it was kind of like being Swiss kind of gave me a little bit of like a license of being a total remote alien person, that like, it's like a Swiss guy that can kind of play funky gave me license above some American guys, that it was really, really weird, and it took me a while to understand what was going on. But somehow I was always the wild card or the maverick, no matter which environment I was in. And I think ultimately that has, I wanted to play jazz, and somehow I figured out after maybe a year or a year and a half that I came 40 years too late, basically, to do what I wanted to do, because I idolized, something about jazz was something for me that I couldn't see it anymore. It's like, well, it was not the time of Bud Powell and Monk and Charlie Parker, nor was it the time of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Count Basie. So it was like, okay, that boat has left, and jazz is more classical music now, and it's not the place where you can ignite something and, go like, let's see what's gonna blow off, So I was naturally drawing more to communities where people were a little bit more into experimentation, and it was not as dogmatic. So I found a couple of people in the downtown scene, and somehow I gravitated away from jazz more into backbeat music and more into electronic music, more into programming, and then I could sort of like reconnect or reclaim with my European heart, which was more like an experimental, the nature of being more experimental. And I guess in the mid-90s, or the 90s were pretty much dominated. The new things were like indie rock, or grunge, or whatever you might, neo-punk and electronic music. So with the onset of those styles, or electronic music became less dogmatic and more experimental, with people like, the Chemical Brothers or Aphex Twin, O-Trash and Photech and Square Pusher. I could relate to that. I could see the bebop aspect in it and the jazz aspect. And although electronic music is very much a premeditated medium, it's much more like painting than actually performing, So I needed to close that gap between improvised music, which I was always drawn to, and what I loved about jazz, and just go out on stage and create something on the spot, and bring that together with the texture of electronic music, which was new and fresh. So that's what ultimately led me to create my own thing, or just trying to start my own thing, which I think at that point, it was not up until that point where I became more American, which I understand. Like, America is about coming here and do your own thing, and that's why I started to mess around with, machine beats and things like that, and that evidently led to playing the music that I play today.